My name is Mara Torres. I am 33 years old. I am standing in the private dining room of the Alder Street Club with a cloth napkin folded in my lap and a glass of orange juice going warm in front of me, watching my brother explain, for the third time in 10 minutes, exactly how important this brunch is. He does not know what I do for a living. Not really. He knows the words, attorney, courthouse, some kind of law thing downtown, but he has never once asked what kind, and I stopped correcting him around year 4. He knows I leave the house early and come home late. He does not know why. He has never wanted to know why badly enough to ask a second question. He has not understood me for 11 years, and I had long ago stopped expecting him to. But I want to tell you how we got to this room, because it did not begin here. It began on a Tuesday in March, 6 weeks before this brunch, at 9:14 in the evening, when a text message from my brother lit up my phone while I was still in a downtown conference room with the lights half-dimmed, reviewing a filing that would matter to more people than he would ever meet at that dinner table. The message said, "Hey, so about the engagement dinner Friday. Don't come. Tyler's mom is a district attorney, and we can't have you embarrassing us. You know how you get. It's just easier this way. Love you." I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the conference table and went back to my filing. I said nothing. If you're wondering how a grown woman ends up being disinvited from her own brother's engagement dinner by text message, sent between the salad course and the wine list of his planning, the answer is that it did not happen all at once. Nothing like this ever does. It happened in small increments, over 11 years, each one small enough on its own to be forgivable, and large enough together to become a shape. It started the year I passed the bar. I called my mother from the parking lot outside the testing center, still shaking, still not quite believing the number on the screen, and she said, "That's wonderful, honey," in the exact tone she used when my brother Dennis brought home a certificate from a weekend sales seminar. Not dismissive exactly. Just filed. Filed under things Mara does, the way you'd file away a hobby. It continued the year I took my first job as a deputy prosecutor in King County, handling cases that kept me at my desk until midnight 3 nights a week, cases with real names and real families on both sides of them, and my mother introduced me at Thanksgiving that year as our Mara. She does something downtown with paperwork. Dennis, who had just been promoted to regional sales manager at a company that sold commercial flooring, got a toast. I got asked to help clear plates. It was never one moment. That's the thing people don't understand about a family that decides who you are early and never updates the file. There was no single cruelty I could point to and say, "There, that was the wound." There were 400 small ones, and I absorbed each of them the way you absorb weather, noting it, adjusting for it, moving on, because making a scene about the 11th time felt disproportionate to the 11th time itself, even as the pattern underneath it grew teeth. By the time I left the DA's office to go into private practice, trial and appellate work, mostly complex civil litigation and select criminal appeals, the kind of docket that put my name in front of judges who remembered it, my family's understanding of my career had calcified into something almost willfully vague. "Mara's a lawyer," my mother would say at gatherings, in the tone of someone reading a fact off an index card they hadn't reviewed in years. Never what kind. Never what that meant. Never, not once, did anyone in my family ask to see me argue a case, though I had invited them for separate times over 9 years, and 4 separate times something else had come up. Dennis was different only in that his dismissal came with more confidence behind it. He had always been the one who could walk into a room and be believed before he'd said anything worth believing. Where I made my case with evidence, Dennis made his with certainty, and our family, generation after generation, had never learned to tell the difference. That was the 14th time in 3 years he had introduced me to someone at a family gathering without mentioning what I did for a living at all, not incorrectly, not vaguely, just not at all, as if the omission cost him nothing and gained him something. I nodded once. Then I went back to my coffee. There is a specific vocabulary my family used, one I'd cataloged, the way you catalog a language you've had to learn to survive in. My mother's version came dressed as warmth. "We're so proud of you, we are. We just think this particular world is a little beyond what you've been exposed to." My father's came dressed as practicality. "Nobody's saying you're not smart, sweetheart. We're just being realistic about who fits where." And Dennis's version, the one he'd perfected by his late 20s, came dressed as protection. It's not that we don't think you're capable. It's that Tyler's family runs in different circles, and we don't want anyone to feel, I don't know, out of place. Out of place. I had heard that phrase, or some cousin of it, at every family function for a decade. I had never once heard anyone ask what circles I actually ran in, or noticed that the circles in question included appellate courtrooms and task force panels, and, eventually, the office of the very woman they were so anxious not to embarrass in front of. I want to be precise about something because it matters. None of them were monsters. My mother sent thoughtful birthday cards. My father remembered my law school graduation date, even if he'd had a work conflict that kept him from attending it. Dennis, in his own limited way, loved me. He simply loved a version of me that had stopped being accurate a long time before that Tuesday text message arrived. That is, in the end, the more dangerous kind of dismissal. Not cruelty. Convenience. It is so much easier to keep believing the old file than to open a new one. Before I tell you what happened in that room, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? I want to see how far this story travels before the end. My competence, if you want to call it that, was never a secret. It just required someone to be curious enough to look. By the time Dennis got engaged to Tyler Whitfield, I had spent 11 years building a career that had very little to do with paperwork and a great deal to do with rooms like the ones I was about to walk into uninvited. I had tried cases in front of 3 different judges who would later go on to sit on the State Court of Appeals. I had argued and won a wrongful conviction appeal that got a man's 22-year sentence vacated after new forensic evidence came to light, a case that had, for 1 week, made the front page of the regional section, a fact my family had somehow managed to miss, or to see and file under something Mara did. I had built a name in that courthouse that people used with a certain weight when they said it. None of this had ever crossed the threshold of my family's dinner table because none of them had ever asked, and I had, somewhere around year 7, stopped volunteering it. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from explaining your own worth to people who have already decided the shape of your life without consulting you. I had simply stopped. What my family did know, because Dennis had mentioned it approximately 11 times in the 6 weeks since the engagement, was that Tyler's mother, Diane Whitfield, was the elected district attorney for the county. Not an assistant, not a deputy. The district attorney, the name on the door, the one whose office ran press conferences when it mattered. Dennis treated this fact the way he treated most facts that reflected well on him by association, as a kind of personal accomplishment. Tyler's mom is a district attorney, he'd said at Easter, and again at my mother's birthday, and again, with a slight edge this time, on the Tuesday night in March when he texted to tell me not to come to the engagement dinner. We can't have you embarrassing us. What Dennis did not know, what none of them knew, because none of them had ever asked and I had never told them because at some point telling people who don't ask starts to feel like begging, was that I had stood across a courtroom from Diane Whitfield 11 times in the past 9 years. 4 of those times, I had been opposing counsel, arguing against her office's position on cases she personally supervised. 3 times, we had been on the same side of a joint task force reviewing wrongful conviction claims, sitting on the same panel late into the evening, arguing details that mattered to people's actual lives. And once, the case that had made the front page, the one my family filed away without reading, Diane Whitfield's office had been the one to formally decline to re-prosecute, standing beside me at the press conference, though the cameras had been pointed mostly at her. Diane Whitfield did not know my brother's last name. She knew mine. She had known it for years. The test for whether a hidden competence is legitimate in a story like this one is whether the skill is causally connected to what happens next, not just background color. Mine was about to be the only reason anyone in that room understood what was happening at all. There was a particular Thursday for years before the brunch that I think about more than the others. I had spent 3:14 in the afternoon, the last day of the fiscal quarter, a detail that meant nothing to anyone but me, standing outside a courtroom on the 9th floor, having just watched a panel of appellate judges rule unanimously in favor of a client who had spent 6 years insisting on an innocence nobody with power had bothered to examine closely. I called my mother from the hallway, still in my robes, voice shaking in a way it almost never did. She picked up on the 4th ring, told me she was glad, and then asked whether I'd be able to make it to Dennis's company picnic that weekend, because he was being recognized for his sales numbers, and it would mean a lot if the whole family showed up. I went to the picnic. I did not correct the order of importance. I have never been able to fully explain, even to myself, why silence felt easier than insistence, except that insistence, over and over, eventually starts to feel like begging for a kind of attention that should never have needed to be earned in the first place. The text about the engagement dinner was not, in the end, the thing that changed anything. I had absorbed disinvitations before, smaller ones, less explicit ones. I would have absorbed this one too, if my mother hadn't called 2 days later. "You're still coming to the brunch Sunday," she said. Not a question. A logistics update, delivered in the brisk tone she used for seating charts and RSVP counts. "It's just family, and a few close friends of Tyler's parents. Dennis didn't mean anything by the dinner thing. Friday's just very formal is all, and he's nervous, and you know how he gets when he's nervous. But Sunday's casual. You should come." I understood the arithmetic immediately, even if she never would have said it aloud. The formal dinner, the one with photographs and toasts and a guest list Dennis controlled down to the seating cards, was the room where appearances mattered enough to exclude me. The Sunday brunch, casual, family-adjacent, harder to uninvited daughter from without it becoming its own kind of scene, was the room where I was allowed back in quietly, as long as I understood my role in it. Present but small. There but not seen. "I'll be there," I said. "Good," my mother said. "Wear something nice. Tyler's mother will be there, and you know, she's very professional." A pause, the kind she always left before saying something she considered generous. "You don't have to talk to her about work stuff. Just be yourself." I set down the phone instead of answering that. I did not call Dennis. I did not send a message defending myself, cataloging the cases I had won, the front page I had made, the name Diane Whitfield already knew before my family ever learned to say it correctly. I did not need to. There are things you carry not because you need them, but because putting them down would mean admitting you were never going back, and my record, my name in that courthouse, was not something I needed to hand my brother as proof. It already existed. It had existed the whole time. He had simply never looked. I spent the 6 days before the brunch the way I spent most weeks. In depositions, in a hearing that ran 4 hours longer than scheduled, in a late-night call with a client whose freedom depended on a filing deadline nobody else in my family would have understood the stakes of. I did not prepare a speech. I did not rehearse a confrontation. I picked out a navy suit I had worn to argue in front of the Court of Appeals 18 months earlier, because it was a suit I trusted, and because some decisions don't require strategy so much as showing up as exactly who you already are. I did not tell my family what I did. I simply stopped hiding it. On the Thursday before the brunch, my colleague Priya stopped by my office with 2 coffees and the particular look she got when she already knew something was wrong before I'd said a word. I told her about the text. About the casual brunch my mother had reframed the disinvitation into. Priya, who had sat beside me through the Alvarez appeal and half a dozen task force meetings that ran past 9 at night, set both coffees down and said flatly, "Your family knows Diane Whitfield's son is marrying into their family, and they still don't know who you are?" "They've never asked," I said. "That's not an answer," Priya said. "That's a diagnosis." She looked at me for a long moment. "You don't owe them a defense, Mara. But you're allowed to stop making yourself smaller, so the room stays comfortable. Those aren't the same thing." I didn't have a response to that right away. I set down my coffee instead. She was right in the way people who have watched you for years are usually right about the things you've stopped being able to see clearly yourself. I had spent 11 years treating my own career like something to apologize for bringing up, not because anyone had ever explicitly told me to, but because the absence of curiosity had taught me, slowly, that volunteering it would only be met with the same practiced, filed-away nod. So I had learned to make myself quiet in rooms where I had, by any honest measure, earned the loudest chair. I did not decide that Thursday to do anything differently. I only decided to stop doing the one thing I'd always done, which was shrink preemptively before anyone had even asked me to. The Alder Street Club's private dining room smelled like lemon oil on polished wood, the kind of smell that means someone was told to make a room look important on short notice. 22 people had gathered for what my mother called just family and close friends, which turned out to mean 4 long tables, a string quartet warming up in the corner, and a level of formality that made Dennis's earlier claim about the casual brunch feel like one more small inaccuracy in a long pattern of them. Dennis saw me first. I watched something cross his face. Not quite alarm, more like recalibration, the look of a man doing quick math on how much damage control a Sunday morning could absorb. He crossed the room fast enough that his fiancée, Tyler, had to catch up. Mara.
Hey.
I didn't think. He stopped himself. Glanced toward the head table, where an empty chair sat beside a place carved that read D. Whitfield. Mom said you'd be here. That's great. Just maybe stay a little more in the background today, okay? Tyler's family's watching everything. I heard him. I said nothing. I reached for a glass of water instead. We can't have you embarrassing us, sweetheart. We're just being practical. It's not personal. I had heard some version of that sentence in one form or another for 11 years, delivered by different mouths in the same register. Warm on the surface, absolute underneath, the kind of dismissal that never announces itself as cruelty, because it doesn't have to. Nobody in my family had ever raised a voice at me. They had simply, patiently, over more than a decade, decided who I was and declined to revise the decision, no matter what evidence arrived. I took my seat near the back, at a table with cousins I saw twice a year, and I let the morning happen around me the way it always did, my mother circulating with a practiced smile, Dennis holding court near the windows with Tyler's father about golf courses, my aunt asking me, without much interest in the answer, whether I was still doing the law thing. Still doing the law thing, I said. I set down my coffee instead of saying anything else. At 10:52, the doors at the far end of the room opened, and the room did the thing rooms do when someone with real weight enters them. Not loud, not obvious, just a slight change in air pressure, conversations trailing off half a beat before people fully registered why. Diane Whitfield walked in wearing a charcoal blazer, the kind of unhurried posture that comes from 20 years of being the most important person in most rooms she enters, and a face I recognized immediately because I had watched it deliver closing arguments and press statements and, once, an apology on behalf of an office that had gotten something badly wrong 9 years earlier and had the integrity to say so publicly. She scanned the room the way people in her position always do, cataloging, not idly looking, and her eyes landed on the back table. On me. She stopped walking. The string quartet kept playing. Nobody else had noticed yet. Counselor Torres? Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the particular clarity of someone accustomed to being heard the first time, and it crossed 22 conversations and landed in the exact center of the room. I set down my coffee. D.A. Whitfield, I said. Good to see you again. The room went silent in stages. First the tables nearest us, then outward, like a stone finding still water. I watched my mother's hand pause halfway to refilling a water glass. I watched Dennis's fork drop against his plate with a sound too small to explain the silence that followed it, and too loud, somehow, not to. Diane crossed the room and extended her hand, and I stood to take it, and for a moment we were simply two colleagues greeting each other the way colleagues do, a small, unremarkable courtesy that had apparently never once occurred inside these four walls before. I didn't know you were connected to this family, Diane said, and there was genuine warmth in it, the kind that comes from actually knowing someone's work. Small world. Are you here for Tyler? And I'm sorry I didn't catch your... Dennis, I said. My brother. Diane's eyebrows lifted, just slightly, the particular expression of a person recalculating a picture that had just gained an unexpected piece. Your brother, she repeated. She looked past me toward the table where Dennis was still sitting, very still, his hand resting on the fork he hadn't managed to pick back up. I had no idea. Dennis has mentioned his sister a few times. Actually, I don't think he mentioned what she does. No, I said. He usually doesn't. I let her finish. I did not fill the silence that followed with an explanation, a justification, or a single word more than the truth required. What happened over the next 20 minutes did not involve me raising my voice, producing documents, or delivering a single line of vindication I had rehearsed. It didn't need my help. It simply required people to watch two professionals have an ordinary conversation in a room that had spent 11 years insisting one of them didn't belong in it. Diane Whitfield pulled a chair from the nearest table and sat down beside me, which I understood to be, in the language of people like her, a deliberate and visible choice. "I have to tell the table," she said, with the easy authority of someone who has never once worried about whether a room would follow her lead, that Miss Torres argued one of the most important appellate cases my office has been involved with in the last decade. The Alvarez matter. Some of you may have read about it, front page, regional section about 2.5 years ago now. 22 years, overturned on new forensic evidence. She looked at me. My office declined to re-prosecute. That was frankly the correct call, and it was largely because of the work Miss Torres put in front of us. I remember the case like it was last week. A woman 2 seats down, Tyler's aunt, I would learn later, said quietly, "Wait, that was you." "That was me," I said. I did not elaborate. I did not need to. The physical reaction word came from my mother, not from me. She had gone the color of the tablecloth, her hand still frozen near the water pitcher, and I watched her set it down without pouring anything. Diane continued, unhurried, the way people do when they have no idea they're detonating something 11 years in the making. "We were also on the joint task force together, wrongful conviction review, 2019 through 2021. Twice monthly meetings that ran until 9-10 at night some weeks. I don't think there's a prosecutor in this county who doesn't know Mara Torres' name." She smiled at me, genuinely. "It's an honor to have you at my son's engagement brunch, honestly. I had no idea you two were related." "Neither did most people," I said. 3 exit statements happened in the space of the next several minutes, though none of us were counting at the time. Dennis said quietly to no one in particular, I knew you did law stuff. I didn't know it was that." My mother said, to Diane, in a voice that had lost its usual brisk confidence, "We're so proud of Mara, of course. She's always been so private about her work." And Tyler, standing near the head table with the particular horror of a bride watching her wedding become a family excavation site, said, "Dennis, did you seriously not know your sister argued the Alvarez case? That was in, like, every paper." I let each statement land. I did not correct any of them. I reached for my water glass instead of answering, because there was nothing left for me to add. The room was doing the work 11 years of small dismissals had never done. It was updating the file. The consequence cascade that followed was quiet, but it moved through the room like weather. Beat 1. Diane Whitfield, over the next half hour, introduced me, unprompted, 3 separate times, to other guests as Mara Torres, who I've had the privilege of working across the table from more than once, which is a sentence that does more damage to 11 years of casual dismissal than any confrontation I could have staged myself. Beat 2. Dennis found me near the coat check as the brunch was winding down, his composure only partially rebuilt. "I didn't know," he said, "about the Alvarez thing. About any of it. Why didn't you ever say something?" "I said something for 11 years, I told him. You just weren't the one who had to listen." I understood. I didn't need to explain further. I picked up my coat instead of saying anything else. Beat 3 came from my mother 3 days later in a phone call she made specifically, I think, to say the thing she couldn't say in front of Diane Whitfield. "I looked up the Alvarez case," she said. "I read the whole article. Mara, why didn't you tell us?" "I invited you 4 times to watch me argue in court," I said. "Nobody ever came." There was a long pause on the line. "I know you were disappointed we couldn't make it," she said. "I wasn't disappointed," I said. "I stopped being disappointed a long time ago. I just stopped expecting you to update what you knew." My mother was quiet for a moment. Then, in a smaller voice than I'd heard her use in years, she said, "Diane Whitfield asked me, at the brunch, how long you've been practicing." I didn't know the answer. I had to guess. She let that sit. "That's not." I didn't like how that felt, Mara. Realizing I didn't know. "Now you know," I said. I understood that this was, for her, as close to an apology as 11 years of habit would allow in a single phone call. I didn't need it to be more than that. I set the phone down gently when the call ended, instead of holding on to the conversation longer than it needed to last. Dennis called again 2 weeks after the brunch, this time without Tyler in the background, without an agenda I could detect. "I've been thinking about the wedding," he said. I want you to give a toast. Not because of the DA thing. Because you're my sister, and I should have made room for that a long time ago, whether or not anyone famous was in the room to notice. I let the silence hold for a second before I answered. I'd like that, I said. It was not a complete repair. 11 years does not undo itself in a phone call, and I did not expect it to. But it was, for the first time in longer than I could remember, an actual question asked in good faith, one that didn't already assume the answer. The fantasy completion image arrived 2 weeks later, in the form of an email from Diane Whitfield's office. Not personal, entirely professional, inviting me to speak on a panel her office was co-hosting on wrongful conviction reform. Alongside 2 state appellate judges and a name I recognized from a case I'd tried against her 9 years before I ever knew my brother would fall in love with her son. I read the invitation standing in my own kitchen at 7:40 on a Tuesday morning, coffee going cold in my hand, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for 11 years. Not vindication, exactly. Something quieter than that. Recognition, maybe, arriving finally from a source that had never needed convincing in the first place because it had known who I was the whole time. I said yes to the panel before I'd finished reading the whole email. I forwarded the invitation to no one in my family. Not out of spite. I no longer needed them to witness my life in order to believe it had happened, but because for the first time in 11 years, the fact of my own work felt complete on its own, without an audience required to make it real. I want to tell you something. Setting a limit is not an attack. It is information. When you finally stop performing smallness for people who have always assumed your silence meant agreement, you are not being cruel to them. You are teaching them, often for the first time in a decade, where respect actually begins. You can love the people who dismissed you and still refuse to collapse back into the version of yourself they needed you to be, the one who stayed quiet at the back table, so the room could stay comfortable. Love is not a blank check. It never was, and it was never supposed to be. The people who choose to see you really see you before any of it is proven, before the front page, before a district attorney says your name across a crowded room, are, in every way that matters, more your family than the ones who share your blood. Biology is a fact. Belonging is a choice, and it is a choice some people make correctly the very first time they meet you. Walking away from the people who have cast you as a supporting character in their own story is not bitterness. It is the only rational response to 11 years of being filed under the law thing. You cannot grow in a room that was never built to hold the size of you. And the quiet that exists on the other side of all of this, the mornings where no one at the table is deciding in advance how much space you're allowed to take up, that silence is not emptiness. That is what it was supposed to feel like the whole time, and most people never get to find out. People who need you to be small do not recover well from finding out you weren't. My brother said his fiancée's mom is a district attorney because he thought that fact made him important by association. He never imagined it would be the thing that finally told his family who I already was. Tell me honestly, if you had spent 11 years being introduced as just the family member with a vague law job and the truth finally arrived in a single sentence across a silent room, would you have stayed quiet like I did? Or would you have spoken up years before it ever got to that brunch table? I think about that sometimes. I think most people who have lived a version of this story already know the answer, because most of us have sat at some version of that back table, waiting for a room to catch up to who we already were. I gave the toast at Dennis's wedding, 6 months later. I did not mention the brunch. I did not mention Diane Whitfield, or the Alvarez case, or 11 years of small omissions. I talked about my brother as a kid, the version of him I actually loved, underneath all the years we'd both let calcify into something smaller than either of us deserved. Some repairs don't need an audience either. They just need someone willing to keep showing up once the room has finally learned to see you. The story you just heard was inspired by real experiences shared on public platforms including Reddit and other online communities. It has been thoughtfully adapted and reimagined for storytelling purposes. All characters, situations, names, and settings are fictional, altered, or generated using AI tools. Any resemblance to real individuals or events is entirely coincidental and unintentional. This story was created to deliver positive messages, emotional insight, and meaningful reflection, not to represent or defame any real person or situation.